Amhara, Fano, People Organization, Manifesto, and the Path Beyond Resistance. A deep historical and philosophical analysis. My name is Abebe Negash, and I speak on behalf of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace. I am an engineer by profession and a refugee who has dedicated his life to fostering truth, dialogue, and healing among my people. I grew up with Fano. Many of those now active were my friends and brothers in spirit. I was among the early organizers of peaceful demonstrations in the Amhara region, seeking dialogue with the TPLF. Over time, when peaceful means failed and violence spread, I found myself standing beside the resistance, not as a warmonger, but as someone who understood that when survival itself is under attack, self-defense becomes a natural light. Yet, as the years passed, I began to see that divisions among Fano factions were becoming a distraction from Ethiopia's collective purpose. I come to realize that unity, not fragmentation, is what our nation needs. While I honor those who defend themselves and their communities against atrocities, killings that at times resemble genocide, I also believe that our ultimate victory must come through peace, justice, and reconciliation. The attempt to paint the Amhara people as historical oppressors or colonizers does not make sense to me. It has only deepened the wounds and justified violence against innocent people. Alongside this, the attacks on Orthodox Christianity, the Amharic language, and the culture of Amhara people reflect a moral and spiritual decay that Ethiopia must overcome. My hope is to bridge understanding and help our people move beyond cycles of vengeance towards a future where truth serves life, not power. The Amhara Fano People Organization or political organization, Manifesto and its core vision. The Amhara Fano political organization released a comprehensive manifesto on October 24, 2025 through Ethio-reference, and this document represents a significant milestone, the first structured political declaration from within the Fano movement. It identifies itself as the political wing of the Fano armed resistance and seeks to represent a vision for Ethiopia rooted in national unity, justice, and constitutional reform. At its heart, the manifesto claims that Ethiopia's modern political crisis is not a coincidence. It is a culmination of a deliberate historical process that began approximately 80 years ago. According to AFPO, Amhara Fano political organization, this process started with the emergence of ethnically defined militias during the shifting geopolitical climate of the 1940s and 1950s. In their view, these movements, particularly those rooted in the Tigrayan struggle, gradually transitioned from being resistance groups to political elites. The manifesto argues that this transformation entrenched ethnicity as a political weapon, something that has shaped Ethiopia's government and constitution ever since. Find this true. The AFPO believes that the prosperity party as a continuation of this lineage, perpetuates a system that inherently divides citizens along ethnic lines. In their words, Ethiopia suffers from a constitutional crisis requiring a constitutional remedy, which I find this true and agree. The party's centralization of power, manipulation of ethnic identity, and institutionalization of hatred they claim are direct descendants of an ideology introduced decades ago. To them, the current political framework is the continuation of a fascist and ethnocentric model dressed in the guise of federalism. That's true too. The Amhara Fano political organization Manifesto proposes 6 primary solutions to this structural crisis, which it represents not merely as policy points but as existential reforms. 1. Territorial integrity. Ethiopia's unity and sovereignty must be preserved without compromise. I find this true, and I find this must come first. Second, cultural and religious protection. All cultural and religious identities are sacred heritages of humanity and must be safeguarded. I agree. And this is true. Number 3, security structure. Ethiopia must possess a strong and independent defense system to ensure internal and external peace. 4. Progressive federalism. Administrative regions should be determined based on development potential, historical ties, population, and geography, not ethnicity. 5. Land reform. Ownership should be diversified among individuals, the government, religious institutions, and communities with new freedoms for exchange, inheritance, and banking. 6. Ethnicity-state decoupling. The Constitution must separate ethnicity from governance, just as modern democracies separate religion from the state. These points, though concise, represent a radical thinking of Ethiopia's constitutional and political order. They strike at the foundation of the post-1991 system established under the EPRDF, which institutionalized ethnic federalism. To understand the full significance of this document, one must place it within the historical continuum that produced Ethiopia's current predicament. So let's see the historical trajectory from liberation to division. You see, Ethiopia's political evolution across the last century has been marked by alternating cycles of centralization and fragmentation. The AFPO Manifesto implicitly situates itself in opposition to what it considers the ethnicization of Ethiopian politics, a process that began in earnest after the fall of the Derg in 1991, but whose roots stretch further back. In the mid-20th century, Ethiopia was emerging from the trauma of Italian occupation. The post-war order, reconstructed under Emperor Haile Selassie, emphasized unity, modernization, and sovereignty. But it also marginalized certain groups and failed to address inequalities in land ownership and governance. These internal tensions provided fertile ground for revolutionary ideologies. In the 1970s, the Derg regime sought to abolish feudalism but ultimately replaced it with militarized centralism and brutal repression. This tells me if the Derg thought they abolish feudalism, which means the land being owned by few, and compare it to what is happening today, no one owns land. Their own land is not theirs. Pay taxes for the roof and the walls. Amazing, isn't it? It was within this climate that ethnically based liberation fronts such as TPLF, ELF, TPLF means Tigray People Liberation Front, EPLF, Eritrean People Liberation Front, and OLF, Oromo Liberation Front, rose to prominence. A few Amharas, but voiceless. They promised liberation from Amhara domination, quote unquote. A narrative that later became a political instrument. By the time the TPLF-led EPRDF, Ethiopian People Revolutionary Democratic Front, I think that what it means, seized power in 1991. The notion of ethnic self-determination had become the organizing principle of Ethiopian governance. So the 1995 Constitution codified this idea, making ethnicity the primary unit of political identity. To the FPO and many of its supporters, this represented a betrayal of Ethiopian unity. They see the constitution not as a document of liberation, but as a mechanism of division, a system that pits communities against one another under the illusion of autonomy. By institutionalizing ethnicity, it transformed social identities into political battle lines. When the EPRDF evolved into the Prosperity Party in 2019, the ideological foundation remained largely intact. That wasn't why I fought for. That wasn't my struggle in that peaceful demonstration. I believe the idea has been hijacked. Anyways, the FPO views this continuity as evidence that Ethiopia's ruling order still operates under the same ethnic logic that birthed it. Thus, in their reasoning, reforming the Prosperity Party without rewriting the constitution is like repeating a collapsed house. Repainting a collapsing house. Now, if you look at the philosophical foundation of the AFPO's argument, the AFPO Manifesto represents a humanist argument that political systems must reflect shared humanity rather than inherited division. The proposal to decouple ethnicity from the state is not only political, it is moral. It seeks to restore citizenship as the primary bond among Ethiopians. This mirrors principles found in modern political theory, particularly those advanced by thinkers who warned against identity-based governance. When ethnicity becomes the foundation of power, politics transforms into an arena of survival rather than cooperation. The FPO is called to separate ethnicity from the constitution parallels the Enlightenment idea that the state must transcend sectarian identities to ensure justice for all. However, the AFPO, Amhara Fano political organization, situates this philosophy within Ethiopia's unique spiritual and historical framework. For them, Ethiopia is not a nation, it is a civilizational heritage. It's just not only a nation, it is a civilizational heritage. This is a moral trust. They draw on the historical unity symbolized by Orthodox Christianity, the Amharic language, and the shared struggles for independence. In this worldview, the current ethnic system represents a betrayal not only of the state but of the Ethiopian soul. This notion resonates with the deeper African struggle for post-colonial identity. Across the continent, artificial borders and imported political models fractured pre-existing social orders. The AFPO's vision, when interpreted generously, seeks to reconstruct Ethiopia as a moral polity grounded in shared values, not imported ideologies. So then what's the limit of armed struggle here and the imperative of peace there? While the AFPO Manifesto conveys a structured vision, its roots in armed resistance present a profound contradiction. Violence, even when defensive, carries the seed of future injustice. Having lived through this transformation myself, first seeking peace, then standing with resistance, and finally returning to peace, I understand both the necessity and the peril of armed struggle. See, Fano emerged as a spontaneous expression of community defense against state oppression and local atrocities. Yet, over time, decentralization and factionalism eroded its unity. Competing leaders, conflicting ideologies, and regional rivalries diluted the movement's moral clarity here. In some areas, undisciplined elements committed excesses, tarnishing Fano's image as a purely defensive force. My concern today is that if this fragmentation continues, Fano risks being remembered not as a people's defense, but as a symptom of Ethiopia's broader disintegration. The challenge, therefore, is to elevate the moral foundation of resistance, to transform legitimate self-defense into a disciplined, truth-centered civic movement. True resistance is not measured by how many battles are fought, but by whether justice and peace follow. The AFPO Manifesto lays a foundation for such a transformation, but it must be accompanied by a philosophy of reconciliation. Ethiopia cannot be rebuilt through endless cycle of retribution. The future demands a balance between memory and mercy, justice and forgiveness. Now, back to interpreting the AFPO vision through Ethiopian Hearts for Peace. Through Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace, I advocate for a technocratic and meritocratic approach to governance, one that aligns closely with AFPO's call to decouple ethnicity from the state. The principle of merit, knowledge, and wisdom must replace ethnic patronage as a criteria for leadership. This does not mean erasing identity. It means transcending it. Ethiopia's diversity should be celebrated culturally, not politicized institutionally. Federal religions can remain autonomous in development and governance, but their cooperation should be guided by shared national goals. Furthermore, The AFPO's emphasis on land reform resonates deeply with my vision of self-sufficient local governance. Land is not merely property, it is identity, livelihood, and security. Allowing communities and individuals to manage it freely would restore dignity to millions, yet this must occur within frameworks that prevent exploitation and environmental degradation. Security reform, too, must evolve instead of competing militias. Ethiopia needs an inclusive regional defense that reflects all regions and atrocities under one oath, to protect life, not political power. So while searching for truth, where history and responsibility meet, to find truth, one must step beyond propaganda and emotion. The AFPO Manifesto contains both truth and bias, both light and shadow. Historically, it is correct that Ethiopia's modern constitution entrenched ethnic divisions. It is also true that Amhara civilians have faced tragedies, targeted killings, and displacement in various regions, particularly in Oromia, Walaga, Benishangul Gumuz, RC, and so on. These are human rights crises, not political talking points here. Yet it is equally true that the cycle of grievance and retaliation has hardened all communities. Each side holds its own narrative of victimhood. The challenge, therefore, is not to decide who suffered more, but to understand how all suffering emerged from a broken system. Truth must serve reconciliation, not revenge. A true reconciliation, that's what we mean here. Ethiopia's salvation depends on collective moral awakening. The Amhara cannot free themselves by defeating others, nor can any group claim peace while perpetuating fear. We must rebuild Ethiopia from the ground up with honesty, empathy, and courage to face our past without being chained to it. We are talking and moving toward a new constitutional era when we discuss the FPO's demand for constitutional reform, because it echoes what I have long envisioned through the Council of Wisdom and modular governance. Ethiopia requires a constitution that decentralizes power without ethnicizing it, a system that empowers regions to self-govern based on efficiency, justice, and knowledge. A new constitutional order could emerge through national dialogue, guided by elders, technocrats, and community representatives, not politicians. Is the current initiative by Prosperity Party to have a conversation working? No. We have to look at the role of religion, culture, and language that must be preserved as moral and spiritual treasure, but kept separate from administrative power. This balance could honor Ethiopia's ancient identity while building a modern, merit-based future. Such transformation cannot be imposed by force. It requires a moral revolution rooted in truth. Only through an honest reckoning with history can we write a constitution that reflects both the pain and promise of our people. So the AFPO Manifesto is a significant document in Ethiopia's modern political journey. It reflects both the exhaustion of violence and the yearning for a new moral order. It speaks with the voice of a wounded nation, yet within it lies the seed of transformation. For me, the meaning of Fano has evolved. It began as a spirit of defense, because a call to justice, and must now mature into a movement of renewal. Ethiopia stands at this, and that's between vengeance and vision. If we choose vengeance, we will dissolve into perpetual chaos. If we choose vision, we can rebuild a civilization where truth, not tribe, defies belonging. I dedicate my work through Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace to this path, to lift our people beyond the noise of division into the clarity of shared humanity. Let truth be our defense and peace our victory. Ethiopia today. The paradox of leadership and persistent ethnic division is more than one can imagine. Ethiopia today presents a paradox. Its leadership, particularly in the rhetoric of the Prime Minister, can sound grounded, historically conscious, and genuinely Ethiopian. In his parliamentary speech, one can hear references to national unity, historical lessons, and cultural identity that resonate as thoughtful and deliberate. To many, this rhetoric signals a leader who is attentive to Ethiopia's complexities, aware of its past, and seeking to balance competing interests. Dear brothers and sisters, however, this Prime Minister, when you give it a close examination, reveals that this appearance of grounding is shadowed by the continuation of structural patterns that have perpetuated division for decades. Despite the seemingly national tone of leadership, Ethiopia's political framework, rooted in the 1995 constitution and reinforced under the Prosperity Party, remains inherently ethnicized. The mechanism of governance continues to prioritize identity as a central axis of political organization. According to analysis by groups such as the AFPO, this system represents the continuation of 80 years of fascist tendencies that have historically shaped Ethiopian politics, from Italian occupation strategies to post-imperial and revolutionary regimes. These tendencies manifest in policies and administrative structures that allow ethnic identity to dictate access to resources, political influence, and personal security. In practice, this perpetuates marginalization and enables cycles of violence. Across Ethiopia, these structural dynamics translate into concrete suffering. Ethnic politics are alive in every corner of the nation, affecting the Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, Benishangul, Sidama, Afar, and other communities. People are being displaced in mass and subjected to targeted killings. Alongside these ethnic populations, are Orthodox Christians experience power vulnerabilities, as religion and languages are often conflated with perceived historical dominance. This creates a dangerous framework in which entire populations are treated as traits or historical oppressors, justifying aggression against them. The combination of ethnicized governance, historical narratives of division and armed factionalism has generated a complex multi-layered crisis. The situation is further complicated by the fragmentation within both the resistance movement and the federal government. Multiple Fano factions operate independently, each pursuing its own strategy and narrative, while the central government remains divided in its capacity and priorities. This disunity ensures that violence continues, administrative control is inconsistent, and any meaningful reform is slow to materialize. While the Prime Minister's speeches may convey wisdom and grounding, the lived reality of the Ethiopian people is one of continued insecurity, displacement, and fear. Thus, the Ethiopian paradox is clear. Leadership can sound rational and historically aware, yet the systemic structure they operate within continue to facilitate division, marginalization, and violence. The persistence of ethnic politics under the current constitution, combined with fragmented governance and ongoing armed resistance, creates conditions where mass displacement and killings continue unabated. In this context, the grievances of the Amhara and Orthodox Christian communities are not only legitimate but urgent, demanding recognition and structural correction. Ethiopia's leadership and governance must confront these enduring patterns if the nation is ever to achieve sustainable peace, justice, and unity. From what I saw in the world politics, from what I saw in different countries in the world, those countries whose name is written in the Bible, the believers are vanishing. Ethiopia is not immune. Over 40 times its name is in the Bible. I fear Orthodox Christianity can be vanished forever if things continue the way they are today. The legacy of colonial era fascist strategies continue to shape Ethiopia, where ethnicized politics and engineered divisions, from historical manipulations to projects like the Blue Nile and Grand Resonance Dam, fuel cycles of violence and genocidal acts, both within and beyond its borders. The painful loss of Eritrea exemplifies how external and internal forces, influenced by lingering colonial frameworks, dictate the fate of nations and nationalities in Africa. If this is not true, I welcome you to prove me though. In Ethiopia, the only African country never fully colonized, these structural manipulations still enable indiscriminate destruction, amplified by technology wielded by both government and factional actors. Ethiopia's loss of Eritrea also meant the permanent forfeiture of roughly 1,000 kilometers of coastal boundaries, a sea access, while Djibouti was separated under French influence and historically vital ports like Barbara, long tied to Ethiopia, were effectively removed from its control. These are enduring wounds for the Ethiopian nation. The current Prime Minister, fully aware of this history, leverages it in media narratives while simultaneously perpetuating what many view as the final stage of colonial style fascism on the ground, leading to mass killings, displacement, and atrocities of unprecedented scale. Yet much of the mainstream media and the international community remain silent, raising the urgent question, for how much longer will this truth be ignored? Duh. International community is formed by those from colonial powers. When we fight among each other, we're doing their dirty work. Anyways, Ethiopia stands at this moment, at a moment of deep spiritual confusion, where political power has merged with shifting identities and beliefs. You see, leadership has become a mirror of the nation's fragmentation, invoking at once Orthodox, Muslim, Protestant, and Gada traditions, often for political ends rather than genuine reconciliation. If one man can be all of the above, that person must have spiritual confusion. This blending of faith and authority without inner harmony has opened a dangerous spiritual vacuum. When power lacks a moral center, it becomes an instrument for destruction, not healing, something darker. Across the land, communities that once shared bread now live in fear. In the north, entire population were displaced and brutalized. In the Amhara regions, new rounds of violence unfold, just like it was in Tigray, even worse. In Oromia, both Christians and Muslim believers face repression and humiliation. The cycle of mobilizing one youth group against another have left deep scars and mistrust among all Ethiopians. This is not the failure of one man alone, though spiritually confused, but of a generation of leadership shaped by unresolved wounds. Again, there could be a spiritual confusion here. And there is a good colonial humiliation, internal division, and a loss of truth. Who can tell you truth today in walk of life? Ethiopia's heart bleeds not only from bullets and prisons, but from the erosion of moral clarity. Healing must begin by naming the sickness honestly. Political opportunism wears the mask of religion, ethnic pride, replacing national compassion, and the silence of the world emerging and enabling endless suffering. Until the spiritual wound is addressed, through truth, repentance, and wisdom, the people will remain in darkness, and the promise of Ethiopia's unity will remain buried beneath fear and propaganda. Following is my analytical note on factions, ideology, and moral standing. Across Oromia, RC, Benishangul, and other regions, recent reports of atrocities against civilians show that the line between political factions and state structures has blurred. Whether under the Oromia regional government, the Prosperity Party, the Oromo Liberation Army, the whatever federal or elements within the national defense structure. The ideology driving these campaigns often appear uniform in practice, marked by the targeting of Amharas and Orthodox Christians, as well as moderate Muslims who stand for peace and national unity. Do you know what's worse to be in Oromia today? Is to be both Orthodox and Amhara, and speaking the language of, and wearing red, yellow, and green stripes in whichever part of your clothing, hat, or anything. This convergence of violence points to a systemic problem rather than isolated events. The coordinated nature of attacks, displacement, and destruction suggests not mere conflict but an attempt to reshape Ethiopia's demographic and spiritual landscape through fear. Look at Addis Ababa. Are people secure? They live in constant fear. Demographic change is already made in the name of corridor development. It's good to see it, but how many people lost their homes? Where are they? Such acts, regardless of their perpetrators, amount to collective punishment and require independent international investigation. Even as this memo is written, new reports continue to emerge, including recent killings in the RC zone, evidence that the cycle of violence remains unbroken. In contrast, the Fano movement, despite its division, continues to define itself as a defensive force, emerging from the instinct to protect communities facing what they perceive as existential threat. Its moral claim rests on self-defense and the protection of civilians. While no armed group is without fault, Fano's efforts to protect the treatment of prisoners and injured soldiers, evidenced by reports of Red Cross involvement, reflect a moral awareness absent in much of the state's conduct. Therefore, Fano has a moral superiority here. This moral distinction is vital. The legitimacy of any force in Ethiopia tragic conflict will not be measured by its rhetoric, but by how it protects life, preserves humanity, and restrains vengeance. If Fano's moral compass remains aligned with these values, it can transcend the cycle of hatred and emerge not as another faction, but as part of the solution that restores Ethiopia's conscience. Thank you very much. Again, this is Abebe Negash, and thank you.